So we're going to get right into this. Three secrets to housing stability. Surprise, there's no secret, right? It's diversity, equity, and inclusion. But it goes a little deeper than that as we begin to discuss this. And I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. So we'll just get right to it. Let's see here. Come on. All right. So first, a little bit about who the PHRC is. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission is the leading civil rights enforcement agency for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we're empowered by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act of 1965 and all of its amendments therein. What we do basically is a two-part mission. The first part is to enforce PA's non-discrimination laws. So that's the PA Human Relations Act, the PA Fair Education Opportunities Act, and we also enforce the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. We have a work-share agreement with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which makes us a substantially equivalent agency to their federal agency, which means we can investigate a federal complaint and we take the lead on a federal complaint, and they kind of follow along on the investigative process. And if we miss something when we close a case, they may look at it and say, oh, you missed this, let me reopen it and we'll finish it on our end. That's the beauty of that relationship. We also promote equal opportunity for all. And so trainings like this fall under that umbrella. We're trying to promote equal opportunity for all in the state. A little bit about me. As you heard earlier, I was the former director of specialty marketing for an aftermarket automotive parts retailer. So that involves marketing in the African American, Latino, and military markets throughout the United States, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. Basically what that meant is making sure that we had representation that looked like the communities where we do business. Making sure that we have marketing initiatives that spoke to those populations and their situations. And also it meant that I was the chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for that company. And then chair of the Housing Development Corporation out of Lancaster. There's a housing corporation called SACA Development Corporation. So I sat on and was the chair of that board as we constructed brand new housing, about 150 brand new housing, made it available to first-time home buyers, thereby affirmatively furthering fair housing. Also licensed insurance underwriter, as well as a licensed insurance agent. So what do you think I'm going to say when I hear somebody say to me, well, my insurance won't allow the pit bull to be a service animal because, you know, they just don't allow it, they won't cover me? I would say get another insurance agent because they would be guilty of violating the Fair Housing Act. So it's interesting to have that perspective from the insurance, because that's one of the complaints or one of the arguments I hear all the time from property owners is that, you know, their insurance won't allow a specific breed of a service animal. And we can talk about that a little bit further down. Former intake officer for the Lancaster Housing, for the Lancaster County Human Relations Commission. I was an intake officer, so everyone that came in and had a complaint would see me first. I did this for both employment and housing cases, and then transitioned into an investigator exclusively on the housing side. And then finally, director of Housing Equality and Equity Institute, where I was there for 5.5 years, actually, and I put together programs that affirmatively further fair housing through program advocacy, things like landlord mitigation funds, rental education courses, and obviously the Section 811 program, which is another voucher that is out there for individuals anywhere from 18 to 61 years of age that are disabled and are transitioning from a rehabilitation or nursing home into their own apartment unit with some supports as they need. So that's just a little bit about where my mind comes from when I look at the topics that we're going to be covering today. What I'd like to say is that if you have a question as I go through, I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. Don't be shy. Yell it out there, put your hand, use the emojis that you have there, raising your hands, And I would like to answer. If not, if you're shy, you can also type it in to the chat box. Jonathan has graciously accepted keeping an eye on that and making sure that I don't forget anybody that might be in the chat. So thank you, Jonathan. So 3 secrets to housing stability. Why is this important? Anybody want to take a guess as to why it's important? Not the 3 secrets, but the housing stability in your world. Why is that important? Anybody want to take just a guess? There are no wrong answers, by the way. But, and you could also type it in the chat if you'd like. All right, not hearing anything, I'll tell you why. Housing stability equals income stability. So in my former position at the Housing Equality and Equity Institute, one of the things that I dedicated my time to was making sure that I educated all sides in and around housing. So that means tenants, that means the housing provider, that means banking, that means planning, the Department of Planning, the public housing authorities, social service entities. Why? Because at some point or other, they're all going to reach into housing. Housing is absolutely everything, right? Housing dictates how far you will go in life at times, what your wealth will be, what your educational prospects will be. And at no time have we learned that more than in the current situation that we find ourselves in, this pandemic. What we have found in this pandemic is that it really does take a bunch of us working together to ensure that people maintain housing. Maintaining housing, especially with the limited affordable housing out there, is sometimes more important than even attaining housing. And you got to be able to retain the housing that you have. And housing stability is a big part of that. When I have surveyed, I used to do this program with housing providers. I would call it the landlord snack and chat. And it was usually done in the evening. I would put out some snacks. Landlords would come over. We'd have an informal discussion about some of the trials and tribulations that they go through with tenants, right? And how that factors into fair housing and what their rights are as housing providers and what the tenants' rights are, but in an informal setting, because my job is not to hammer over the head. My job is to bring you in as a partner. You know, housing stability doesn't happen if I don't have partners, right? And so housing providers are partners. But at the same time, when I survey these partners and I ask them, how many of you knew all the rules and regs that are associated with your chosen area of business of being a landlord, 9 out of 10 consistently told me, no, I didn't know. But 100% reported that through trial and error and a lot of money spent, they've learned their lessons because of all the times they've had to go to eviction court. I mean, wouldn't it be nice to be able to have this information on the front end instead of having to do it retroactively? So one of my functions was to go out and be proactive about the education and not leave out the housing providers. Many times when somebody does these trainings, they're usually doing it for the community or social service entities that are working with the community, and that's fine and it's needed, but it's not ever going to change as far as the misunderstandings and discrimination that sometimes happens, the evictions that often happens if we're not educating both sides. And so today we're going to talk about this in terms of, you know, at the end of the day, the result of what we discuss will lead to housing stability, which leads to income stability. Because no one got into this business of real estate or landlording or property management. They didn't get into this business to be in court all the time. If they had, then they'd be lawyers, right? And so they didn't get into this to do that. They're not lawyers. They would rather do what they intended, which was to get a stable income, right? And the only way you know that is by having a solid foundation of knowledge and partnerships within the community and knowing where to go, resources where you can go to get the help you need, because housing providers also need help many times. They don't know everything, right? And so that's how we're going to approach this today. All right. Some of this stuff you're going to know, and some of this stuff you're not. I ask you to keep an open mind as we go through. But please feel free to chime in, ask questions, give me scenarios if you have them. And we're going to try and look at this. I chose this method of doing this after speaking to Maylene. I wanted to give you a more non-traditional presentation of the general fair housing premise. I wanted to give it to you in a practical sense so that you could see how it applies to the industry. And I hope that I accomplished that. That was the endeavor for me today. So moving on. First thing is, as I said before, you don't know what you don't know, right? Sounds like a Yogi Berra reference, but it's absolutely true. Every property owner should know, right? Every property owner, okay? Because I know the real estate professionals, they know a lot of this stuff. But property owners who you have to work with, they don't know the basics of landlord-tenant. They don't know implied warranty of habitability. They don't know the covenant of quiet enjoyment. They sometimes know a little bit about the ADA. Fair housing is a foreign concept to them. Now, to put that in context, imagine going to your favorite restaurant, sitting down, white linen napkins, it's an elegant place, soft music playing, right? Nice ambiance. And then they bring you your food, but you discover that neither the owners, nor the servers, nor the cooks have any idea what the health code requirements are. What do? I would imagine you'd probably leave. You probably wouldn't have gone there. Or you'd probably turn away all the food that they bring you food that is substandard, you'd probably turn that back. Unfortunately, in housing, it doesn't work like that. And many of the people accept housing that is substandard. They won't complain because I'm just lucky enough to have housing, right? And so when I look through the Commonwealth and I can see that maybe as you go across counties, I'll pick on Lancaster County. Lancaster County, 62 municipalities. Out of those 62 municipalities, 31 of them have some sort of rental property maintenance code. Okay, and so as a director of Housing Equality and Equity Institute, what I discovered through the calls I received on a monthly basis is that the calls I was getting were for property conditions, terms and conditions on lease, some discrimination. And the calls, when I break that down and look at the demographics of those calls, what I found was that they all lined up squarely within the protected classes of the Fair Housing Act. So they line up by race. They line up single family female head of household with children, disabled, individuals resettling here from other countries. So the people that are the most vulnerable are the ones that are calling in. Overwhelmingly, that's what I was getting, right? And the reason I was getting that is because, again, if you have 62 municipalities, only 31 of them have some sort of ordinance that protects the renter and ensures that they live in a healthy, safe housing. That's a problem. And it's a problem that now here at the Commonwealth, I'm discussing with legislators and I'm discussing with the leadership here to see how we advocate for better housing quality. That's not the fault of any one person, it's just the way the system is. And so the system needs to be corrected, right? So yes, you don't know what you don't know. And when it comes to landlords, especially how many of you, and you could be honest with me or you can not tell me at all, but I have heard calls, I've received calls from real estate agents that have said, I got a problem. I have this owner, got a nice house. And he said to me that he would like me to rent it, but would rather go through the applications because he doesn't want Latinos living in the house.
Really?
This is happening. And so, the question is, what do I do? Because imagine not imagine, you're in the tough situation where you've got an owner, he's hired you to do a job, to manage this property, he's asking you not to rent to Latinos, and now here's your opportunity to basically say, can't do that. And you know what's going to happen. It's like, well, then I'll rent it myself. I won't utilize it. And so it's important, and I've always told this to property owners. I said, it is important, and you are at a huge disadvantage when you don't know what your property management company knows. In other words, if you don't know fair housing, then you can't hold them accountable. And at the same time, you can't really form a partnership with that property management company because you don't understand where they're coming from. So you're always going to be on this clash. You're always going to feel like they just don't want to do what you want, but they have rules to follow. They have licenses to preserve. And so having that conversation kind of clears the cobwebs sometimes. And so what I found is, as I had this conversation throughout my career at the HEEI, when I started, our landlord engagement through calls, the monthly calls that we would get, was 0. By the time I left, 20% of the calls we got on a monthly basis were landlords and property owners because they wanted to learn more. I have a tenant, he wants a service animal. Can I restrict breeds? And then we go through the explanation and I send them the law and what it says. And so this is exactly why we want to educate everybody on all the sides, because we want better understanding. And I think it would make it so much easier for those in your position to be able to work with owners that have some kind of understanding of what's out there and what you have to deal with and what you have to follow. So yes, that's the, you don't know what you don't know. Any questions so far? I know I'm rambling on. I'm just trying to get everything in. All right, so let's get to the fair housing basics, right? We are celebrating Fair Housing Month, so happy Fair Housing Month, everyone. On April 11th, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed in the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which was meant as a follow-up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 68 Act was expanded on previous acts and prohibits the discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and as amended in 1988, familial status, and disability. It's also known as a Title VIII. Now, when we look at what the Fair Housing Act is supposed to do, right? It has 2 main goals. The first goal is to end discrimination and to promote diverse, inclusive community. That's the first goal. The second goal that the Fair Housing Act has is to refer to as affirmatively furthering fair housing. Okay, and it basically embodies the values of fair access and equal opportunity. But here's the thing. While the first one has to do with education and outreach and enforcement, that first goal is reactionary, to say the least, right? When do we, as enforcement agents, end up doing any of that education? Well, more often, it happens at the heel or at the end of an administrative investigative process where we found probable cause of discrimination, or the housing provider just said, you know what, I want to conciliate. And that conciliation includes training from our staff. So it's reactionary, right? The second goal is meant to be proactive, right? It's supposed to lay the foundation so that everybody understands what fair housing is, and it begins to promote equality, okay? And in that responsibility, and in that second goal, is HUD, the public housing authorities, counties, cities that are receiving community, the CDBG grants. All of these entities have a responsibility to affirmatively furthering fair housing. The problem is, like everything else, right? The first part of the goal is something that we've been working on since 1968. And even though affirmatively furthering fair housing has been part of the Fair Housing Act forever, it has lagged behind. And so a lot of the inequalities that you are finding today, you are finding because of that lag. The way the system was set up, the historic ramifications of how housing was set up, the redlining history, all of that is part of that affirmatively furthering fair housing that even though everyone knows it exists, little has been done, or little has been done to hold those accountable or hold people accountable. So in 2015, the Obama administration came as close as you could possibly get. Some say he might have gone a little overboard, but here's why they're saying that. They created this matrix whereby all of the individuals receiving, all the individuals or all the entities receiving the federal funding had to check boxes. They had to say, how are you affirmatively furthering fair housing? Okay, and check the box. And so, like anything else the government puts together, it's a one size fits all, but it doesn't fit. And so some municipalities were able to do it, some people weren't, and so it just didn't work out. They ended up going from the assessment of fair housing, they went back to the analysis of impediments to see if they could do a better job. That didn't work either. But it was the first time that an administration tried to hold people accountable for affirmatively furthering fair housing. Then in comes the Trump administration, and I'm thinking that, and this is just my opinion, not the opinion of the PHRC or its commissioners, but I'm thinking that it was used as a political rally for base, where you come up and say, well, you know, what we're going to say is anything that you do to promote fair housing is affirmatively furthering fair housing. That's literally what that rule says. Whereas Obama's rule says taking real efforts besides enforcement to promote neighborhoods of opportunity, access, and inclusion. Okay, and so though we have Fair Housing Act, we haven't been living up to the second part of this. And guess what? You folks in real estate are part of that affirmatively furthering fair housing. You know, that you play a vital role in that, you know, in ensuring access to people. So when you see a program out there, for example, that is a first-time home buyer program, and though it has a lot of hoops to jump through and everything else, give that a chance, because when you give that program a chance, you are actually allowing someone that may not have access to the housing to actually gain access to that housing. That's how we affirmatively further fair housing together. All right? Makes sense? All right, Jonathan, how we doing? Any questions in the chat?
None in the chat so far. I know definitely I'm interested in kind of the concept of AFFH, and you know, how do you guys determine, you know, whether or not a, you know, community is making those, you know, decisions?
Great question. Is there more?
No.
So that's a great question. For the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, it is not necessary for us to evaluate that. That gets evaluated by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. However, as a substantial equivalency agency, I meet with them on a monthly basis, and we talk about AFFH as well. Why do we talk about that? Because my opinion, and again, I've been studying this for years, so I'm a little geek when it comes to this, right? But my opinion is that disparate impact lives within affirmatively furthering fair housing. Let me explain. Remember when I told you that most of the calls that I would get on a monthly basis, those calls were because of property maintenance issues, because there were no property maintenance codes in those areas, and the calls I'm receiving line up squarely with the protected classes of the Fair Housing Act? That's a disparate impact issue. If we're not ensuring that everyone lives in a safe, healthy home, and the calls we are receiving line up with the disabled, single parent family, female head of household with children, individuals selling here from other countries, the disabled, those returning from incarceration. When we look at that, if we're happy with that as a county, as a city, as a commonwealth, if we're okay with that, then I think my opinion is that we're okay with disparate impact. Okay, so when the laws are set up and they look neutral and everyone's covered up, but it has a disparate effect or a negative effect on one particular group of people, that's disparate impact. And so in the AFH, they have to, HUD has to evaluate what counties are doing and what cities are doing to affirmatively further fair housing. And I had a discussion yesterday with one of the evaluators. She actually does the capers, they call them the capers. And she was saying, well, no, this city, you know, I know that you were going to help this city when you were there, but this city isn't, I mean, I dinged them severely, is what she told me. I dinged them severely because they are not affirmatively furthering fair housing. You can't come to me and say, I'm going to put in curb cuts and have a nice day. That's not the way it works. You know, and what happens is, again, I'm not saying that any city is doing this intentionally. What I am saying is that they need to have a fair housing expert in the room when they're doing this. When they're doing their analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, they need somebody in the room. And I have a lot of experience with this because I did this with Lancaster County. I led the analysis of impediments to ensure that we're not just speaking in generalities, that we're actually talking about the people that live within the city and are having problems getting housing. And why are they having problems getting housing? Is it disability? Is it limited English proficiency? Is it credit? Is it, and again, credit might be a disparate impact issue, but that's a whole other workshop. But the idea is that the evaluation comes from HUD. They look at that, they look at everything. The other part of this is that a lot of municipalities will say, we're going to do X and this and this and this and this, and then they don't really do a lot of that stuff and no one holds them accountable. But that evaluation does happen at the HUD level. Thank you, Jonathan, for that question. So the intent behind the affirmatively furthering fair housing was to expand housing choice. Ergo, that's what the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice is supposed to do. And it was supposed to make all neighborhoods places of opportunity by providing the residents with all the amenities and assets that they needed to flourish, right? So in short, the affirmatively furthering fair housing is an instrument of equity within the Fair Housing Act, okay? I have a buddy, he's become a buddy of mine most recently when I met him. His name is Jeffrey Paul May of International Development Planning. And he calls the AFFH the CAT scan, which allows us to see where our deficiencies lie. Okay, and if we don't know what those deficiencies are, we can't fix them, right? But there's a problem too, and I think that one of the problems is that many people look at equity and equality as the same concept. And so I'm not saying that anybody here does this, but as a habit for me, in order for me to walk away feeling like I've done something substantial today, I need to go through this. And I ask you to bear with me, okay? So let's take on equality using this picture. I believe Medellin said that her son's gonna be doing a track meet, so she'll understand this right away. We're all lined up here. Looks like we're gonna run. These people are gonna run one lap around the track, okay? And you would see here that in the perfect scenario would be that we're all starting from the same place. We have the same opportunities and the same access. In this picture, we can assume that all these people are in great shape and able to run a full lap. But if you know about track and you're running a full lap, what's wrong with this picture? What's wrong with this picture is you can't run a full lap here. And here's why. The person on the inside is running the same distance, but not the person on the outside. Because he's on the outside, he's going to have to run a bigger circle, which means it's not equal. This is one of those ways of me demonstrating that just because you're all getting the equal start, it doesn't mean it solves the problem of equity. Okay, so that's equality. In this particular place, yes, they're all starting from the same place, but they're not running the same distance. They don't have the same access. As opposed to equity, which is these people are going to run one lap around. This is a 400 or an 800, but they're all running around that track. But in order to ensure that we all have the equal access, in order to be able to run the same distance, we have to stagger the blocks. And that is equity. So putting it in terms of housing, if we know that somebody has a barrier, language barrier, physical barrier, then we need to stagger the resources so that we can meet them where they are and give them the opportunity to have the same distance to run as everyone else. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Well, that's just my explanation of equity and equality, because I know that sometimes they get interchanged. And I know that in banking, equity means really different, right? And in real estate, equity is something different. You know, hey, I got equity in my home.
Interesting scenario.
And so that's what that is designed to do. And I wanted to do that just to kind of give you that takeaway in understanding in your world, when we're saying equity, we're talking about how the resources, and remember I mentioned earlier about the first time home buyer program, that's an instrument of equity that allows somebody access that would otherwise not have access. Those programs where you have Section 8 voucher, that's an instrument of equity. So it bothers me sometimes when I see an ad and say, no, no Section 8. Whoa. If I look at a Section 8 voucher, if I look at the research that HUD paid for some 6 years ago, they went across 5 states and they analyzed the refusal rate of Section 8 vouchers or housing choice vouchers that property housing providers have. And when I look at this research, and then I look at ads that say no Section 8, I'm thinking to myself, okay, how's this different from no Hispanics allowed? And let me explain that. The HUD research basically states that of the people receiving from those 5 states, of the people receiving housing choice vouchers, 72% of them are single female head of household. 64% are individuals of color. So when it puts it into a new context, especially for me in those 5 states, that when I hear or when I see an ad that says no Section 8, I can change the protected class. So no Hispanics, no Blacks, no individuals with disabilities, no individuals from other countries. It's a disparate impact issue, right? And so that to me is stuff that's still going on. And again, it really has to do with the way our system is set up more than anything else. I refrain from putting blame on people, right? The system has been set up this way, but we are on our way to fixing that system. That's my optimism, is that we're on our way to fixing that system. We're going to right the ship, but it's going to take all of us understanding equity and equality and understanding disparate impact and disparate treatment and understanding all of these concepts that sometimes are a little beyond our grasp, definitely beyond our control at times. But it's going to take all of us and a keen understanding of these to be able to right the ship. Any questions on that? If not, I will move on. Affirmatively furthering fair housing and real estate professionals, right? As a housing
Adrian, I
provider,
have a quick question.
sure.
This may not be timed correctly in your presentation, but I was making note because I had heard at one point that they were going to make a requirement for landlords to have training and kind of get certified before they can even, rent their properties out. How how close are we to something like that? And what kind of training is that going to include? Have you heard about this?
Actually, I'm on the governor's dismantling racism housing subcommittee, and that's one of the topics of discussion that we are having.
Wow.
We're also having that discussion at the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors Diversity Committee.
Mm-hmm.
We're having that discussion because it's absolutely true. You know, I don't want to be crass about it, but the Landlord Tenant Act in 1955 is nothing more than a how-to evict handbook. That's really all it is. It's not an act, and an act should talk about the rights of both the tenant and the landlords, right? It should not have an implied warranty of habitability, and it should not have an implied covenant of quiet enjoyment. It should have a covenant of quiet enjoyment and a warranty of habitability, right? Because this is just basic. And so there are a lot of things that we're working on. One is a universal lease initiative. I'd like to see one lease. If you get into the insurance, if you get into the insurance industry, there's, you know, even though the forms may look a little different, all the information is the same. The formatting may be different, but the information is the same. Problem with the landlord and tenant situation is that you never know what kind of lease you're going to look at. Some leases are 50 pages, some are just 1 page, some are half a page. That's not a standard to be able to do that. And then, you know, because by and large, housing providers or housing owners, they didn't go to school for this. They may have inherited an additional property and said, hey, we can get some income out of that, we'll rent it. But they don't know that they're part of this affirmatively furthering fair housing. They don't know that there are rules you have to follow, and therefore their attitude has been, it's my house, I'll do what I want. Yes and no. You know, it's your house, yes, but you're going to do what you want, not so much. You know, so it's an initiative that we're looking at. It's very much at the very beginning, but that is something that we're talking about. It's called an independent property or independent housing provider certification. And we're discussing what that looks like, what goes into that kind of curriculum, and also what kind of benefits can we offer on the tail end. If somebody, you know, goes through the trouble of taking the certification course, what kind of commitment can we get from townships and boroughs and cities and states for people that have taken this course? I mean, what does that look like? And so we're at the very early stages of this, and we'll keep everyone posted as we move forward. These things do take some time, but I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
You bet. So real estate professionals are on the front line of insurance compliance with fair housing laws. That's no secret, right? And so one of the ways that you're going to be able to really enjoy that position of being in the front line is you got to seek out partnerships with local Human Relations Commission. We have PHRC advisory councils throughout the Commonwealth. You can go on our website and you know, see which one for your area. Fair housing advocates, there are different organizations that are social service entities that actually have a fair housing element attached to it. And so making partnerships and building partnerships and relationships with those kinds of entities is going to make your job a lot easier. And I'm going to show you how in a couple of slides. So we're going to talk a little bit, because this is something that Maylene and I discussed. We're going to talk a little bit about the protections in housing, and this is going to lead me into how you build those partnerships. And I chose disability because this is the leading call and the leading complaint that we get in housing at the state level. Okay, so the Fair Housing Act uses the term handicap instead of disability under the act. And handicap means with respect to a person's mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. It also has to do with a physical impairment. And usually this person has a record of such an impairment. or is being regarded as having that impairment. As a housing provider working on behalf of an owner who has no idea of the Fair Housing Act or any other laws for that matter, it becomes increasingly important, and what a battle for you professionals to have them comply to fair housing. I'm sure that comes up quite often in your line of work, where, as I stated before, sometimes they want to do things that we really can't do that. Not only are you faced with providing that guidance, you also at times have to ensure your own compliance within your own teams, which is important as well. It's self-accountability. It's a tough task, but I would encourage to seek out the informational resources that can provide training to your teams and owners proactively. We're available. If you need training, I would rather see more partnerships built between real estate and social service entities and or HRCs or advisory councils asking for, hey, I've got this tenant, and maybe it's something that you as the professional come up and say, hey, yes, we're going to manage your properties, but one of the things that we do for our owners is we want them to be on the same page as we are. And so we're going to be taking a training on fair housing, and I want to invite you to this training. Just that alone, and I understand owners are busy, so just say to them, we'll work around your schedule. Or would you like me to send you the presentation that I received? Because at least you know that there's no excuse. You sent them the training. If they didn't view the training, if they didn't learn anything from the training, and they commit an act of discrimination, you have documented evidence, because unfortunately, this is what happens when we get a complaint and it's the tenant against the owner. Guess what? The property management company gets roped right in there too, right? And so what is important is for you to be able to come back and say, well, we offered fair housing training as a proactive measure. We sent them the training on this date. And at that point, our investigators and our legal staff are looking at that and saying, okay, so we need to focus on the owner. See how that works? Let's see. It's just a way of doing things proactively. And let's go on to the next one. So some of the examples of housing discrimination, you're familiar with these: refusing to rent or sell housing, refusing to negotiate for housing, making housing unavailable, setting different terms, conditions, or privileges for sale, rental of a dwelling, providing different housing services or facilities, steering blockbusting, and refusing to make reasonable accommodation or modification. The thing about blockbusting is, I know that a lot of people from real estate, I heard this at another training I was giving, and they said, well, no, blockbusting really doesn't happen anymore. Ever hear of gentrification? They're very similar, very similar. And so again, this is what I meant by what I said earlier. Not only do you have a tough job of making sure that the owner knows that you have to comply with certain rules, you also have to hold yourself accountable, because if not, in the energy of your day-to-day, you could be gentrifying and not even trying. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where there has to be a happy balance. And I think that one of the things that I suggested at this last meeting is make sure that your partnerships are such that you have an equal amount of partnerships with the high-end buyer as well as the affordable housing buyer, so that you can balance yourself out. And whenever you see opportunities to affirmatively further fair housing by plugging in some affordability there, that's going to help you. It'll help keep you'll be able to sleep at night. So let's talk about disability service and emotional support animal. This is one of the largest complaints that I get. The one thing you should know is that it's important. And the reason it's important is because before COVID, it was estimated that 61.5 million Americans, 1 in 4 adults, experience a mental health impairment. This is before COVID. 13.6 million, 1 in 17, live with a serious mental illness. And again, I keep saying this is before COVID. COVID has brought about isolation, loneliness, depression. It has increased mental health issue. It has increased the need, because imagine if you are living and you're the very poor, right? And you don't have phone, you don't have internet, you have nobody coming over, you're alone all the time. You are already having some issues mentally, and now you have this isolation to deal with. This is going to exacerbate your conditions. And this is what has happened throughout the pandemic. And so what ends up happening is that when they do go to their doctor and the doctor says, oh, you're suffering depression and so on and so forth, have you ever thought about an emotional support animal? Why is this important? Because remember, any mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. What are some of the life activities when we're dealing with mental impairment? Concentrating, caring for yourself. People that get depressed, they don't want to care for themselves. They really don't want to clean up anything. They just want to leave. They want to sit in a corner. They are isolating themselves from themselves, which is an incredible. I mean, I took a training on that, and it's part of the trauma-informed training, and it's disturbing what we as human beings not only do to each other, but what we can do to ourselves is disturbing. And so when a doctor comes up and says, have you ever thought about an emotional support animal? A dog, a cat, a bird, whatever. What animals do you like? And then they go in and apply. Now, a support animal usually doesn't have any special training. Instead, serves a function that for the individual with a disability, like some of those examples could be alleviating an anxiety, reducing an individual's depression, keeping an individual calm, making an individual feel safe. We all want to feel safe. And I know that I've heard from people that don't feel safe. This pandemic has really done a number on them. And so when we look at things in that context, we look at service animals and support animals, I think, differently. Because again, when we get that emotional support animal, what are we doing? We're staggering the lanes to make sure that we all run the same distance, that we all have the same access. So this is an instrument of equity, right? As I said, this is for conditions that aren't usually obvious. We can't see them with the naked eye. The person is smiling at you and they're eloquent and they may be, but deep down inside, they are scared, they are timid, they can't wait to get away from this conversation, can't wait to go home and lock themselves away from the world and deal with whatever monsters they may be dealing with in their mind. Another example of this is I often hear, I've done a lot of informal housing resolutions, and I often hear the music upstairs is loud, especially at night, and I can't stand it. And I've talked to the landlord, and the landlord's going to evict the person. But as a property management company, if you're informed and connected, you might be able to get to the root of that, because that person may be hearing voices that are more potentially active at night than they are in the daytime, a mental disability, and they turn up the radio that loud to keep the voices down. Sometimes it's individuals that haven't taken their medication, they ran out of money. And these are just some extreme examples, but we need to look at these situations as individual situations and in the context of the individual and not so much the industry or what the industry pushes, right? So emotional support animals help individuals in that situation. So how can a real estate professional learn more about this and get more involved and at least get informed about what's going on? There are organizations throughout the Commonwealth. I'm very familiar with the United Disabilities Services. They actually train service animals. And I used to do trainings where I would actually I would partner with United Disability Services and ask them to bring a service animal. And so I would do my spiel, the Fair Housing Act, the whole 9 yards. And then they would bring in a service animal, and the service animal would basically, they wouldn't do tricks. What they did was they did what they were trained to do. Open the door, bring me the drink, bring me the medication, turn off the light. You know, those kinds of things. And in one, I was really impressed because the owner of the service animal, she goes into panic attacks, and she trained this animal to react whenever she was going into a panic attack. And so she simulated this. She began to scratch herself. She began to hit herself lightly. And then she went for her head. And the dog reacted and actually thrust his body on top of her to keep her from hurting herself. Okay. And so sometimes an emotional support animal plays a duplicitous role. It also is a service animal, right? Depending on how the owner trained it, because the owner will train it for that purpose in many cases. And then the majority of those animals are trained, and they would be certified, and they do have identification. Emotional support animals do not. They are emotional support animals, right? They're the staggering of the lane so that this individual can have the same opportunity to enjoy their dwelling as everyone else. Does that make sense? All right, as we move forward here, let's talk about hoarding. This is another one that really comes up, and wow, is this not tough? This is tough. You walk into a place and it's going to look, I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. It's going to look very badly. How do you handle that, right? First, you should know that since 2013, the American Psychiatric Association has recognized that hoarding is a mental disability, right? You know, the persistent difficulty with discarding and parting with possessions regardless of their actual value, perceived need to save items, and distress associated with getting rid of them. I have people in my family like this that just keep collecting and collecting. The accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter living areas and substantially compromises their intended use. Now I'm going to show you a couple of pictures, and I'm going to ask for some audience participation. And I know it's 10:56 and I'm going over, Maylene. Am I okay to go over, or?
You're okay. We're going to keep recording, and if anybody, needs to get to a meeting or anything, they can just log out. But we definitely want to get everything on the recording so that we can post it to our YouTube channel for everybody.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So those most often associated with hoarding are obsessive compulsive personality disorder, OCPD, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and depression. So those are within the umbrella that would potentially be your hoarding candidates. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. We're going to have some audience participation, and tell me what you think that is. Is this hoarding?
It's getting there. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Kind of
thank you.
borderline, I feel like. Potentially.
Okay.
Not as bad as what you see on TLC.
Right.
I don't know. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily hoarding. It just looks like someone that's insanely messy.
Right. This is Einstein's den, right? Well, this is actually clutter, right? And though I don't want you to leave here and diagnose hoarding, and I don't want you to do any assessments for hoarding. That is not my intent. My intent is for you to know the difference. And then we're going to talk about best practices of how to handle it. Okay, that will keep you out of trouble from a discrimination based on disability because you regarded someone as having a disability. Okay, so this is clutter, and here's some of the keys. This, for me, looks like a library, a den, a media room, and what does it for me is we have the TV there with it looks like VHS and some books on top of it. We have the stereo system, and we have we have that basically very adjacent to the vinyl that's on the rack there. Have an open book on the chair, which means somebody is already reading that and they're coming back to that. And right in front of that is a computer. So everything here belongs. You know, I'm a musician and I've been a musician for 40 years. This looks like my music room. Sorry, no, don't judge me, but it gets messy, right? This is where you create. And so this is clutter, as opposed to, say, this. We can all agree that this is not clutter. This is the way someone feels. Someone is dealing with a lot. They're dealing with loss. Their life is in disarray. They can't think straight. They're probably taking some medications. They probably have a combination of mental disability and physical disability. So you walk into a room that looks like this. What do you do? What do you typically do? If you don't mind sharing with me, how would you handle that? Let's not say what do you do or how have you done it, but how do you think you would handle that? Anybody want to venture? How do you start that conversation? So let me tell you what I have suggested to many property management companies and many property owners. Is A, you don't want to go in there and say, no, you're hoarding. Obviously, that's a disability, as we know, and you regarded them as having a disability. And now every action you take against that individual will be action that they can come up and put on a complaint and say, because they regard me as having a disability, they did X, Y, Z. So the best way to handle this, best practices, is you first want to have a conversation based on your lease. Listen, your lease says that there should be some health and safety standards maintained. And unfortunately, what I'm seeing violates those health and safety standards. Not only is this putting your health and safety at risk, but potentially your neighbors as well. So that's, use your lease, health and safety standards, how it affects them, and how it affects the neighbors. At no time did you diagnose hoarding. You weren't accusatory. You've kind of set the groundwork. You're in violation. Now, what's next? Next is you're going to come up and say to them, so I need to know, what can we do to get this cleaned up? Because this needs to be cleaned up. It's not affecting just you. It's going to affect your neighbors as well. It has a potential of bringing bugs. It has a potential of bringing rodents, not only to you, but to your neighbors. And that is a violation of your lease. Is there anyone that you can call, a family member, a close friend, anyone you can trust, anyone that you're working with? Now, here's the thing that I think you've all experienced. Most people that have some kind of mental disability, OCD, depression, they're really not shy about sharing those details. You know, if you've built a rapport, they'll come up and tell you, you know, I can't get to it. Or they'll say, yeah, I know, it's my back. You know, I've been going to the doctor and I haven't been able to clean up. Okay, well, listen, I'm gonna have to go back to my office and document this conversation that we're having. So that means I'm gonna send you a document that basically states that this is a violation of your lease. I don't want you to freak out about that, right? I have to do that because that's our protocol. But I wanna help you get through this. So you said you were seeing a doctor. Is there anyone there that you trust enough to maybe recommend someone to help you? Some people will say, I'm all alone. I have no family. There's no one I can count on. I have trust issues. And so you're probably thinking, wow, what happens if that happens? Well, hopefully if you've been listening to this presentation early on, and you heard that little tidbit about making connections with social service entities, my recommendation has always been for property management companies and property owners to have a list of local social service entities that work with mentally disabled, physically disabled, Department of Aging, Adult Protective Services. All of these entities will be a huge help to you, because you've already had that tough conversation. You've already told them this is a violation of the lease. This can bring around rodents. It could bring around bugs, not just for you, but for your neighbors. You've already told them, I'm going to follow up our conversation by sending you an official notice because it's our protocol. I don't want you to freak out. I want you to stay housed, but you need to understand that this is a serious situation. And still, I've not mentioned the word hoarding. Still, I've not mentioned any diagnostics. I've not assessed this for hoarding. I just said, you've got a lot of stuff here that is preventing us, our maintenance, from getting to the electrical panel, getting to the utility closet, getting to your safety of getting out of here in case there's a fire. And all of these need to be corrected. And so for that purpose, I'm going to send you this notice. But if you have a list and they tell you, no, I don't know anyone, I wouldn't even know where to start, you would send that list, or you would give that list. I would say give that list personally to them and say, hey, here's a list of local areas that'll be able to help, hopefully help you with this. But you have to be open and you have to call them. All right. Now at the bottom of the sheet is my number. When you call them, tell them that you spoke to me and tell them that we're going to meet together, you, me, and them, to put a plan together to get rid of this. Now, why do I say that? Because again, the mental disability is covered by the Fair Housing Act. And what you are about to enter into is a reasonable accommodation, right? And I've done these as an informal housing resolution. I met with the property owner. I received a call from a service provider whose property management company said, yeah, you got 30 days to clean this up or get out. And what happened in her situation is her and her husband and her daughter, who's about 17 years old, moved into a smaller house. They had moved from a very big house to the small house. And what ended up happening is they came to the house, and about a month later, the husband dies. He was the breadwinner. They had part-time jobs. And so what ended up happening next is they said, well, one of the ways that we can save money, we're spending $120 on the storage unit because we have all our stuff over there. We have very minimal stuff here. So they took the stuff out of the unit, saving $125, and they brought it all to this house. And it was all over the house, upstairs, up the stairs, and every crawl space, in the kitchen, in the bathrooms, everywhere, right? Small go paths. And so, the property management company said, yeah, my worry is this is an older house. And so I'm worried about the weight on the floor, and plus it's not good for them, and so on and so forth. And so we started this dialogue about the lease and the health and safety and health standards. And they understood all that. So the service provider called me and says, this is what's going on. And I said, okay, I'm willing to meet with them tomorrow at 9 a.m. But I want the housing owner there. Property management is fine, but I need the owner there because we all need to come together and see what we can do. And so they all went there and we met, we walked through. Certainly it was a tough situation, but they agreed to allow for 30-day time period for them to get as much of this cleaned up as possible. And as we're finishing, the lady the owner, the tenant says, I wish people would stop saying that I'm hoarding. I'm not hoarding. This is not hoarding. Just rather than let it go, the owner of the property says, no, sweetheart, I'm sorry. This is hoarding. So I begged pardon and pulled the owner aside. And I said, so now you've changed the nature of this relationship. You've just diagnosed her with hoarding. You are regarding her as having a disability. And so every action you take from this moment forward can show up on a complaint of discrimination based on disability. So if you evict her, she probably has a right to file a complaint, because she's going to say you did this because of my disability, right? I said, so let's go with that 30 days. We'll make a plan, but be ready to extend that 30 days as part of a reasonable accommodation. When you work in a FIP, a Fair Housing Initiatives program, FAP, where I am now, a Fair Housing Assistance Program, when you're working in a FIP, you got more elbow room. You know, you can exercise a little bit of muscle, and that's what I did there. I would never do that in my current position. Wouldn't be allowed, right? But in a FIP, I had the room, and so she basically said, okay, so whatever needs to be done, I'm open to it. You know, I didn't mean to diagnose her, and I said, no, I just wanted to pull you aside. I didn't want to tell you in front of everyone. So all that to say that it's important that you not diagnose. You know what it looks like. You know the difference between clutter, and you know what hoarding is. So now you know the difference. In your mind, you'll be able to see and say, it's a little bit of clutter. I'm not going to go crazy. When you see hoarding, you're just going to come up and say, okay, so this is bordering on your health and safety issue, and you go about it that way. Having those contacts in the local community, one sheet that has your number underneath, and say to them, have them give me a call. Let's work together. I want to keep you housed, but we need to work together, and I need the help of a professional to come in and help you. It's not my role, right? And again, under the Fair Housing Amendment Act of 1988, persons who suffer from hoarding may be entitled to reasonable accommodation of policies, practices, and services when such accommodations may be necessary to afford a person equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling. That comes out of 42 U.S. Code 3604. And so all that to say that a tenant's request for a reasonable accommodation plan to clean the unit due to the tenant's mental disability and avoid eviction would be considered a reasonable accommodation. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. So how, now that we have this tenant, we've given her notice about the health and safety and all of that good stuff. I gave her the one sheet. She made a call to say Mental Health America. Mental Health America said, yeah, we'll send somebody over. And now you're meeting with Health America, and you're thinking to yourself, what's my role in this? Your role is basically to be that property management company. Your role is not to be a therapist. Your role is not to do anything that you don't normally do. Your role now becomes accountability. You've already opened the door to a reasonable accommodation because you're trying to keep this person housed. Now the professional will come in because they have it in their mission. And together, you're going to develop a reasonable accommodation plan. So you have to involve the service provider. I mean, doing this by yourself is unsurmountable task because you're going to run into individuals that suffer from depression and these mental disabilities have their good days and they have their bad days. And only a professional can really deal with these individuals when they're having a bad day, right? And they have the time and they have the expertise to be able to follow through. And so your reasonable accommodation plan should include the specific standards for specific areas. So how do you start? Well, you saw that picture we just had. How about we start with, let's make sure you have an entrance and an egress to your unit in the eventuality of a fire. So you need to do that. And let's put a timestamp on that. Next, we need to have access to the utility closet, to the vents. The heating vents should not be blocked. All of that needs to be cleared out. Maybe that's your second week project. And then, you know, for every step, you develop a timeline. Now, this timeline and this step and this reasonable accommodation is being done with your approval, but really it's being put together by the service provider and by the tenant, because the tenant has to be agreeable to it. That's the reasonable accommodation portion of this. You'll also include who's going to check, and maybe that's where you, as a housing provider, that's where you come in. Okay, I'll come in and we'll decide how many times. Maybe it's 30 days. I'll come in every 30 days and I'll look and see what the progress has been, and I'll go ahead and and journal that progress. And I'll make sure that I communicate with the tenant and with the housing, the service provider, right? The social service person. Then the social service individual will talk about the services residents will accept. There are other services that they may be in need of. Maybe they haven't gone for a psychological evaluation in a long time. Maybe they've never gone. Maybe they've never gotten a behavioral health social worker ever and don't know how to go about it. That's where that professional comes in and helps to establish that. You don't have to worry about it. That is not your role, but you know that that's probably going to be something that's going to be happening. And then what is the method to ensure that we have a permanent resolution, that we will not be faced with this in the future? And maybe that's right underneath that, services the resident will accept. Maybe it's therapy sessions. Maybe it's a visiting nurse. Maybe this person needs somebody to come in on a weekly basis and clean because of this. All of that should be set up in the reasonable accommodation plan. You have to involve the service provider. They know what they're doing. They can make that. And the thing is that the agreement, sometimes it's a court agreement, but I think 9 times out of 10, based on my experience, if you do if you handle it the way I'm telling you, it's going to result. I've had 11 sorry, lost my train of thought. I've had 11 informal housing resolutions, all of them having to do with hoarding, and I've not had one backslide. Because there's a deliberate process of checking in, getting the right professional involved, making sure that that professional is great at establishing trust and rapport from the get-go, so that then they can talk to that person about the services that they will accept. Does this all make sense? Does anybody have any questions? I'm hoping it's of value to you. So,
Do you see a question from John in the chat? It says, in today's low inventory market, some buyers insist on sending a love letter to sellers to make themselves stand out. What are the fair housing risks of doing this?
you know, I'd have to see the letter, right? To be able to see if there's any language in there that provides any kind of pre-steering, right? For example, they could come up and say, I have the inventory in the most predominant school districts possible. I would have to ask what makes them predominant.
I think John was referring to buyer's letters to the seller, you know, saying my family really loves this house and, you know, we just moved here, but basically indicating things about their background that would make them more maybe preferable to
Yeah.
the seller. And I think that's where some of our agents are like, oh, you know, this
Yeah.
letter mentions, you know, they have a traditional family style, you know, setup and stuff. And I think that's where like some of our agents are, you know, even realtors across the board are just like, yeah, I don't know if we should be doing love letters or having our buyers send love letters anymore.
No, that's a good point. And thank you for the clarification. In those instances, I mean, if you follow your protocols with regards to the analysis of who the buyers are going to be and who gets the property, and you're using all of the legal underwriting requirements. And I say that tongue in cheek because, you know, underwriting, I know that we use a lot of desktop underwriting software in this game. And so what ends up happening is, who's writing the underwriting programs? Do they look like the community that we're trying to reach out to? Is it balanced? But right now, according to the disparate impact rule, underwriting is still the best form. That desktop underwriting is still the best form to evaluate because it's the most uniform method of doing, even if it may have some disparate impact. So using the mechanisms that you have and not being swayed by letters would be the best practice.
Yeah.
You know, everyone gets the same treatment across the board. I
Yeah.
appreciate the letter. You know, it's great to know about the people that are going to be buying the house because neighbors may ask, right? But I would probably not use that information.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's definitely what we're seeing. You know, the transformation over time. And as we look at these issues of diversity and equity, the love letters can kind of, you know, unintentionally, but to some sellers, make a buyer seem more preferable based off of things that wouldn't necessarily matter if
Mhm.
you didn't know about it beforehand, before this love letter. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And they seem benign, but sometimes if you make decisions based, if this is part of how you make your decisions, and I'm not saying anybody here makes their decisions this way, but in the energy and the influx and the chase for the kill, because I used to be in sales a long time ago, right? When you're chasing that kill, you're not thinking about all this ancillary stuff. You're thinking, you know, my numbers for the month, right? You live and die by the board. And so what ends up happening is you get into that energy, but is there a pattern of the people that you've sold to? If you look at your pattern and say, here's who I've sold to in the last year, right? In the last 5 years, what's the pattern you come up with?
that's interesting.
Right? And look at that and say, why does this pattern come out? Right? So it's just a self-reflection, and we all do that. We all have to do that self-reflection. You know, when I was in insurance as an underwriter, it was a lot easier because I evaluated according to the underwriting platform. But when I became a salesperson, it was different because now it's about people. You're right there interacting, and there's an energy level, and you have rapport that you set up with some and rapport that you don't set up with others. First rule of sales is make friends. Second is always be closing. So you're patterning yourself to do that, but is there a pattern of how certain people get certain services? And so it's really something where you have to kind of police yourself. As I said earlier, you know, sometimes the toughest job is not only just to make sure the owner is aware of the compliance, but that you yourself and your team are aware of compliance as well. And this is just a constant evaluation that professionals have to do. Any other questions before I culminate here? So the secrets to housing stability, as you saw, when we're talking about hoarding and when we're talking about emotional support animals, when we're talking about equity, you know, those are instruments of equity. Reasonable accommodation is a instrument of equity. When we're looking at those specialized home buyer programs, it's an instrument of equity. I mentioned Section 811 earlier. It's an instrument of equity. Section 8 is an instrument of equity. These are the staggering of the blocks on the starting lane so that we all have the same opportunity. It recognizes that we are not all coming from the same place. We don't all have the same advantage, right? Some of us have barriers, and those barriers need to be addressed on an individual basis to ensure that they all have equality at the end of the day. In short, equality is what we want. Equity is how we get there. Okay. Are there any questions? Also, you know, take away this: communication, open communication, community partnerships, and consistent application of your processes is really what helps you to get to the secret, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you can get there basically by following those steps. That's what's going to get you to where you need to be. And where you want to be is housing stable. How do you get there? You got to stabilize the housing so that you can stabilize the income. Unstable housing means your income is unstable. It all ties together. With that, I'll entertain any other questions that you have. That's it for me. There's my
I had a couple of questions, Adrian. One of them was, what are some of the consequences or maybe penalties that a landlord or a realtor could face for violating the Fair Housing Act?
Okay, so they're going to change. If you're dealing with a local Human Relations Commission, they may have a different remedy base. At the state level, we may say you have to comply, you have to provide the reasonable accommodation. So in the event of hoarding, that may mean you got to put a plan together, you got to work with an entity. In the event of a emotional support animal, you have to permit that animal. So the remedy would be, how do we make the person whole? How do we address the harm, the original reason they filed a complaint? Other remedies could be obviously monetary. If you charged a pet rent and you charged pet deposit, all that money needs to be returned to the individual. So there's a monetary aspect of this. Humiliation, we don't do pain and suffering, but we do humiliation costs. And so that could be pretty steep. That hits the pocket pretty hard. Especially in situations, I've seen situations where we received a complaint for familial status. Listen, I don't want you to live here just because you got a lot of kids. The kids make noise and your neighbors, they're pretty much quiet. I'm not going to rent this to you. That's humiliating. You can't put people through that. You can't discriminate on that basis. And so they basically said, okay, so for the humiliation portion, every individual in that family was humiliated and therefore is calculable. And so in that, it can get pretty steep. There would be legal fees that the person would be responsible for. Training, most obvious, there'll be training, and depending on the severity and whether or not, I use this term, whether or not the respondent, which is the person that committed the act, whether or not the respondent was a frequent flyer, right? It's somebody that I've had come across my desk multiple times. That could also add to it. We would then put into place not only training, but it probably be annual training, and it might be for as much as 10 years. We may also say we want to review your documents on a yearly basis. So those kinds of things, the more egregious, then the worse it gets for that individual. And that's at the state level. When you get into that mode that you're a frequent flyer, which means you're there all the time, that might be a case that actually gets flagged by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they would send to me a consent to reactivate. And what that means, there are two reasons that HUD would reactivate a case. One, that somebody was just neglectful and didn't follow up on the case on a timely basis and whatnot. We don't want that. But number two, which is the one is called consent, is that they saw something systemic in the fact that this person has been across their desk a couple of times as well. And they basically, when they reactivated, said, we'll take care of this one. And that's not a good position to be in, because at that point, they'll partner up with the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. And then it gets expensive. It gets very expensive. So they're depending on the severity, could really change how much. Now, we did a conciliation not too long ago, a couple of them, one for $70,000 on a reasonable accommodation case. And another reasonable accommodation was $90,000 out of the Pittsburgh area. So our investigators are really doing a good job of staying neutral, being that impartial body. But the minute they see probable cause, they go after everything they can. And they have instructions from me. I mean, I've been here 9 months, so my instructions has always been shoot for the stars, because we don't negotiate discrimination. Conciliation is, okay, I'm gonna conciliate, but that doesn't mean we're gonna take a back seat to a negotiation. I'm gonna ask for as much as we can ask, because none of that money comes to the PHRC. It is to make that individual whole. And so the person that creates that harm has to feel it in the pocket. And that hopefully that deters them from doing that in the future. Any other questions? You said you had a couple.
Yeah. So in terms of emotional support animals, is a landlord allowed or permitted, or a property owner permitted, to ask for like supporting documentation?
So an emotional support animal, they can ask, for example, somebody will come in and say, I have a disability and I have an emotional support animal, it's a dog. And the landlord would say, okay, well, some landlords, back when I was in FIP, I would say, here's a set of documents that I need you to give to everyone that asks for an emotional support animal. So find yourself a packet of information that deals with emotional support animals. And it could be a questionnaire that you hand to the tenant and say, could you have your doctor fill this out? Do you have to, does the tenant have to fill that document out? No. According to HUD, no. But the fact that you're treating it in a uniform way helps you out, because they may go back to the doctor and the doctor may say, listen, I really don't have time to fill that out. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send a note. They're going to have my phone number. And with your permission, I will tell them why you need the dog. And usually what you will receive is, to whom it may concern, so-and-so patient, or, Joe Public has been under my care for a number of years for conditions of his mental disability. It is recommended that he have an emotional support animal to help him deal with the symptoms associated with that disability. That's enough. According to the state legislature, that's enough.
Okay.
According to federal legislature, that's enough.
Okay. How about charging a security deposit or something for emotional support animals?
So the Fair Housing Act states that the animal, service animal or support animal, is a direct extension of the individual with the disability, and therefore is not subject to a pet deposit or pet rent. Okay. Now, when I say that, I get a lot of frowns from housing providers. On the other side, though, you can come up and still, hold them accountable for any property damage created by that emotional support animal. If indeed that emotional support animal is a direct extension of the individual with disability, then the damage done by that support animal is as if damage was done by the individual. Okay. And so the other question that I get is, but how do I know when somebody comes in to be a tenant and we've accepted them, or I'm doing my evaluation, how do I know that this animal hasn't created damages somewhere else? And you can't, the truth of the matter is, when you're making your calls and checking landlord reference, you can't come up and ask, hey, has that emotional support animal caused any damage? What you could ask is, was there any damage beyond normal wear and tear that would be unusual to the property? Simple yes or no answer will suffice. Or they may expand and say, yeah, they have this dog, man, and he just kind of chewed and just kind of tore up the place. I had to spend a lot of money redoing the floors. And then at that point, you're not evaluating based on the disability. You're evaluating on the same premise that you've evaluated every other tenant in whether or not they care for the property. Okay. By and large, people that have emotional support animals, for the most part, because of why they have that emotional support animal, to keep them calm, to keep them focused, to soothe them. They want a more docile animal. They're not looking for a high energy animal. All animals, there are no breed restrictions for emotional support animals, emotional dogs. There's no breed restriction, no size restriction either. So you can't put those parameters on it. But usually people that have those emotional support animals, in truth, for a condition, those animals are going to be pretty calm. They need to be in the control of the tenant too at all times. You can't, when you're walking that animal cannot pose a threat to any of the other tenants, or the maintenance man, or the property management representative. That animal should be in control. And if somebody cannot control that animal is aggressive towards other, remember, it's an extension of the individual with a disability, ergo, tenant is being disruptive to others, right? So those are a lot of the questions that I receive usually at the heels of that question. I hope that answers it for you.
Yeah, I just have one more. When it comes to reasonable accommodations for, like maybe a physical disability that was fairly recent, like after an accident or something like that, who has the responsibility to pay for costs of doing a reasonable accommodation or making a reasonable accommodation, or alteration to the property?
Okay,
And
so
do they
let's take,
have to?
I'm sorry, and do they
Do they
have to?
have to offer a reasonable accommodation?
So when we're looking at a housing, multifamily housing unit that is receiving HUD dollars, the expense and the obligation falls on the housing provider. Okay. When we're dealing with a property management company and somebody has been in an accident, they now need a ramp, the responsibility falls on the tenant to make that modification of a ramp. The part that property management companies and property managers play is you must allow for the reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
Okay, you have to allow them to do that. They're doing it at their own money. However, you can also say that's fine, but according to law, you should set aside money so that we can return this back to its state before the reasonable modification was made.
Okay.
And there, for those individuals that find themselves that are recently, in that situation where they may need medical equipment, or they may need a ramp or some kind of reasonable modification. I mentioned earlier the United Disability Services, they have a modification department. And again, that's one of those resources that you want to have on your one sheet that you can come up and when a tenant comes up and says, I need this, do you know who you're going to go to? Or if they ask you, do you know of anyone? You can come up and say, there's a company that does modifications. You might want to give them a call.
Okay.
Because that ensures that it's someone doing it according to code and they have the experience of doing it. It's not Joe Lucky from down the street doing it.
No, that's good to know. All right. That's all the questions I have. Anybody else have questions?
Awesome.
All right.
So I am going to send to Maylene a survey about my training today. I'm also going to send them this presentation. I don't know if you think it's helpful, but I'll send it to you so you have it. My number will be on it, so you can give me a call, drop me an email if you have a question, you come across scenarios. I usually try to get back to people within 24 hours. So if that's helpful, my phone number is there as well, though I probably would not pick up because I'm usually in meetings, but I try to get back to my emails within 24 hours.
Awesome. Well, we
Well,
appreciate
thank you very much. I
Thank you
appreciate it.
so much, Adrian.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Thanks, Jonathan, for keeping an eye on the chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.